All right, y'all, here we go. So in this batch of slides, we're going to talk about the kinds of characteristics that tend to predict whether someone will continue to be a person who stutters or whether they will spontaneously recover. As you may recall, we talked about spontaneous recovery and the fact that upward of 85% of folks who start to stutter as children will actually recover without any intervention from us. So we're going to use this batch of slides to really kind of think about what characteristics are we looking for so that we know whether the child in front of us is likely to continue stuttering without our help or unlikely to continue stuttering without our help. Okay, so as you recall, we are talking about all of this stuff in the frame of the communicative emotional model of stuttering. So today we're actually going to talk about a few different parts of the model. Remember, last time we talked about instances of stuttering. So the actual overt part that is stuttering, the part that you can see. So in this set of slides, we're going to talk about genetic potential, and we're going to talk about emotional reactivity and regulation. And then we're going to talk more about emotion and experience and like speech language planning and production we talked about a little bit at the beginning of this unit, we'll say. All right, so let's go. All right, so environment, genetics, environment, emotional reactivity and regulation, and genetic potential. All right, so there are several risk factors that we know that tend to help us as we're deciding whether the child in front of us will persist in their stuttering or whether they will um, as doctors would say, grow out of it. One of the things we look at is genetics. So we talked about in the last set of slides that 70%, roughly 70% of kids who stutter will have at least one other family member who stutters. So genetics is a risk factor. Another risk factor is time since the onset of stuttering. We know that the longer a child continues to stutter, the less likely it is that they are going to spontaneously recover. So the benchmark that we tend to use is greater than 14 months. So if a child has been stuttering, and it can be off and on, maybe remember we talked about gradual onset versus sudden onset, and maybe it's come and gone over the last 14 months, but it continues. So that's time since onset. We want to know how long this has been going on, and that helps us predict uh, whether it will go ahead and go away on its own. So other things that we use as predictors are concomitant disorder. So I just used this particular graphic to show that some of the things, a concomitant disorder is one that co-occurs with another disorder. So like people who have anxiety and depression, those are concomitant disorders. They're happening at the same time. So in this case, we're talking about concomitant disorders like, I need to change this to DLD instead of SLI, but developmental language delay, learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and these are the ones that we primarily look for, but basically what you're looking for is any other developmental disruption, and that can contribute to the stuttering continuing um, and requiring intervention. Another factor that we look at is temperament, and we're going to talk about that a bit more later, but the temperament of a child can also contribute to whether they will spontaneously recover or whether they won't. Children with inhibited temperament, so more introverted, more difficulty separating from their parents, characteristics like that tend to persist in their stuttering more than kids who are very gregarious and just are out there and will play with anyone, talk to anyone, just very open and outgoing. Okay. Not to say that there's anything wrong with people who have inhibited temperaments. We just know that that's one of the things that research has shown us contributes to kids continuing to stutter versus having it spontaneously recover. All right, so so what we talked about in the last slide were things that are inherent in the child. So like genetics and yeah, genetics. So things that you're kind of built with, because your temperament is something that you come into the world with, and concomitant disorders can be a result of a combination of genetics and environment. So these are things that are part of the child or inherent in the child that make it more likely that they will stutter or continue to stutter if they start. All right, so another thing that, other ways that we measure or possibilities of persistent is seen in speech output. So as we're doing our assessments and we're taking our samples, these are some other things we're looking at. So one of them is called disfluency clusters. So that's when stuttering happens together, like a sound syllable repetition followed by a prolongation on the next word. So it might sound something like but mom wants to go to the store. So that's two stuttering-like disfluencies right on top of each other. All right, another thing that we look at is a high ratio, and this is not the ratio. This number is nonsense. This was just to show ratio. A high ratio of stuttering-like disfluencies to non-stuttering-like disfluencies. So you remember back in the slides on disfluency, on stuttering versus disfluency, we looked at whether or not what we were hearing is something that is very typical of us just trying to figure out what we're going to say versus it catches your ear and you're like, wow, that's stuttering. Okay, so the ratio is if you take the number of instances of stuttering and you divide it by the total disfluencies, if that percentage is greater than 85%, then we know that the child is less likely to spontaneously recover and more likely to continue to stutter and require intervention. And this last one, I'm not entirely sure why I picked it, but what I was going for was that the stuttering has gotten worse or has not improved since its onset. So sometimes parents, especially with a gradual onset, will tell us, oh, well, you know, he used to just repeat just a couple sounds or a couple words. Now he repeats tons of sounds and tons of words, or now he's blocking and he's just super frustrated. That's getting worse instead of better. The getting better would sound more like, yeah, you know, sometimes he used to repeat his words, but I haven't heard it in a while. And now, you know, when he does it, it's maybe just one or two times. Okay. So there you go. So let's review those two slides again real quick. So factors inherent in the child that make it more likely that they will persist, as in continue to stutter without help, is genetics, the time since onset of greater than 14 months, a concomitant disorder like a learning disability, developmental language delay, ADHD, or autism spectrum disorder, and temperament, usually inhibited temperaments. So other things that we look for in their speech output are disfluency clusters, a high ratio of stuttering to non-stuttering like disfluencies, and whether the problem has gotten worse instead of better over time. All right, so now we're going to talk about some characteristics of temperament. So what we find is that kids who stutter are more reactive than kids who don't stutter. So for instance, I had a little girl on my caseload who would freak out if her mother put her hair in a ponytail. I'm talking temper tantrum on the floor, screaming and wailing when her mom put her hair in in a ponytail. Had another one, 3-year-old little boy, who noticed every time his mom changed her earrings and asked her about it. So less able to regulate. So that means that when the child feels things, more reactive, which means they feel all the things, then they're less able to deal with it when when it happens. So on the extreme end of these characteristics, some of these characteristics are also characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. So when you think of more reactive, you think of the kids who the tag in their shirt is itchy and they start to scream and wail. So not like that, somewhere up the food chain from that. But in that's what I mean by reactive. Less able to regulate is the I'm going to freak out because my tag is itchy. Slow to adapt is hating breaks and routines, or if their mom says, oh, in the morning, we're having spaghetti for dinner tonight, and then it gets to dinner time and they're having tacos, the kid freaks out. Or when they go into a new space, it takes them a long time to get used to it. Minimally distractible, that's when you're trying to get the kid to like come in from playing outside to eat dinner, or stop playing a video game or on the iPad or whatever to eat dinner, and you've called their name 4 or 5 times, and then you finally go and like lose it and turn off the TV, and you're like, did you not hear me calling you? And they're like, no. They mean it. They didn't. They were so into what they were doing that they did not notice that you were yelling their name. Sensitive to change kind of goes with more reactive, but this can be something as simple as taking a different route to school. And that also goes in with the craving structure, which is liking things to be very predictable. You know, this is the way we do it. This is the way we always do it. Think, you know, obsessive compulsive disorder, but really mild. They have strong fear. So one child I worked with had been taken, his foster parents had taken him to a water park, and he had like the best time, had just loved every single minute of it, until they were walking out of the park and there was a bug in front of him and he lost it just spectacularly, and never wanted to go back to the water park again. Or actually, when my oldest daughter was little, like when she was a toddler, she was afraid of the drain in the bathtub. So I had to take her out of the tub before I could let the water out, because she would literally start to scream and try to climb the walls of the bathtub if I opened the drain while she was still in there. Difficulty separating from parents. I wish you could see me so I could demonstrate, but these are the kids that you have to peel off like Velcro when you take them like to daycare or to even a birthday party. It doesn't even matter. Their parents kind of peel them off. Some other adult grabs them. They yell and whine, and then their parent leaves, and then usually within 5 to 10 minutes, they're okay. So, if you've never worked in childcare, you should go observe for a day, because there are always kids that do this. The Vanderbilt child care several hundred years ago, it feels like it was my kids. So anyway, check that out. It's definitely a thing. Okay. So another thing we know, we talked about concomitant disorders. So one of the things, so there are a couple different percentages I want you to pay attention to here. One is that 44 to 68% of kids, CWS stands for children who stutter, have some type of concomitant disorder. So 44 to 68%. So that means that really 6 or 7 out of 10 kids in your stuttering caseload are going to have something else going on as well as stuttering. So what we know is that one of the most likely things that they have going on is a phonological or articulation disorder. And what the research has shown us is that 30 to 40% of kids who do have a concomitant disorder, it's going to be a phonological or articulation disorder. Um, Other things that might be concomitant disorders, they could be ADHD, could be language disorder, auditory processing disorder, a behavior disorder, a learning disability in reading, or some other kind of neurological disorder. Lots of kids who have children who stutter, who um, have ADHD as a co-occurring symptom, or a co-occurring concomitant disorder. We have really good research that shows us that that's a thing. All right, so that brings us back to the model. So what we talked about today are environmental things and genetic components that can contribute to instances of stuttering continuing rather than going away with time. We talked about emotional reactivity and regulation as part of that, as one of the risk factors that might keep a child from spontaneous recovery as well. All right, that's all I've got for you in this batch. See you in the next one.